let me, is this working, or can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. To comment on a couple of the points that were raised, at least in the way I do the Marxian theory, if there's a growing productivity, particularly of the productive laborers, I assume you're all familiar, the distinction in Marxian theory between a productive and an unproductive labor and its centrality to the understanding of what we're discussing. And the surplus that's then produced by the productive laborers and appropriated by the capitalists, that can then be distributed in a whole host of ways to secure the conditions of existence of the enterprise to continue. One of those distributions is accumulation of capital. Under certain circumstances, the distribution to that can be large, small, or non-existent. The capitalist has to secure lots of conditions of existence, has to pay his taxes, has to hire lawyers, has to sell commodities through advertising, has a lot of ways of distributing the surplus. It has never been the necessity of capitalism to accumulate. The notion that capitalism necessarily accumulates capital is an argument that was made in the defense of capitalism as a class structure on the grounds that it was necessarily dynamic and progressive and would grow output. Marx ridicules this in the first volume of Capital, trying to argue under some conditions it does that, under other conditions it doesn't. The last 30 years, as you point out, and others do too, it hasn't, for a whole host of reasons. It either didn't accumulate capital, spending the surplus in other ways, or spent its time, as Duncan says, moving production from one place where it was less profitable to another part of the world where it's more profitable, and that's just as reasonable the distribution of the surplus to secure capitalism's reproduction and profitability as any other. And so I don't think we should be surprised if we go through extended periods of capitalism not investing, or investing very unevenly in different parts of the world with the kinds of consequences that Eileen was talking about, and this crazy uneven development that destroys cultures, it transforms politics, and so on. That's the system, that's how it's worked, that's how it's always worked, and we're just observing one particular moment of it. Second comment on the labor movement, I think Duncan was being kind. The American labor movement is an unmitigated disaster. It's been a disaster for 50 years. Those of us who cry about it still have to face the fact that it is a disaster. And to look, as Eileen mentioned, to look at the activities in the streets, say, of Lisbon and of Athens over the last couple of weeks, faced with an austerity program, and look at the United States over the last year faced with a comparable austerity program doing next to nothing, all respect to yesterday's events around education around the United States. Nonetheless, it's a stunning example of the need to rethink the strategic perspective and the critique of capitalism, to refashion a new left and a new labor movement, since any alternative is simply, in my humble opinion, collapsing in the face of the very things that the panelists have described. On the point of concentration, I think we all have to have a sense of humor. Having had discussions now for a year about being too big to fail, our government has conglomerated several financial institutions with the result that they're now larger than they were when they were deemed too big to fail. And one watches this with a stunning display of amazement, not so much that it's happening, but that it seems to be continuously possible to worry about things being too big to fail while we make them bigger. I think that tells you something about what passes for politics in the United States. And the last thing is, I would look at it a little bit different. I don't compare the wage rate to the profit rate. Again, this notion of what the surplus is. The surplus is used in a variety of ways in a capitalist enterprise that appropriates surplus from its workers. One of those ways is to produce what shows up in a profit loss statement or an annual account as the profit of the enterprise. All kinds of other distributions are not considered profit. They're actually considered costs of business in the normal accounting. But in a Marxian frame, if you want to understand the surplus and what's happening to that, and use that as a measure of the success or growth of capitalism, you have to break down the dichotomy wage-profit so that it works to deal with the theory. The United States government does not collect data based on Marxian categories. You've probably noticed this. So you have to do the work yourself, but that's not all that hard to do, and the end result are estimates that are no one whit less reasonable or less without problems than all the estimates made by the government that are used by non-Marxists.
Peter, you
I think we all agree that American workers, certainly if you look at the median male worker, has seen flat wages since the 1970s. That's indisputable. It's a little bit more nuanced if you go to women worker, where there has been some increase. Some minorities have seen gains, and if you look at the median, but high-skilled workers, there may also have been some gains. But basically, the flat wage is a fact. But I think we need to then ask, why is that? I mean, like, why was it rising earlier and then it stopped rising? And I think that's where we need to look at some of the institutional changes and also look at technical change issues to try to disentangle what has been going on. And I think that's vitally important, because if we want to reverse it, we need to be aware of what was it that led to this flat wage trajectory. And I think when we then address sort of more forward-looking what should be done, we should not just be defeatist and sort of assume that whatever happens to institutions is just predetermined by the needs of capital or whatever. I think there are significant degrees of freedom. There are options, opportunities. We may not seize them. It may not work, but they're there. But we need to identify them. And one, coming from Europe myself, I must say that one striking difference, and there are lots of reasons for it, we could debate it for a long time, but one striking difference, it seems to me, is that even on the left in the US, there seems to be this skepticism or hostility towards any kind of collective solution that is implemented by the state. I've had colleagues, left-wing colleagues talk to me about the disaster if our tax rates, if my taxes were to go up by 50%. And you know,
50 or 15?
50. And I went back and I looked, and my taxes are so bloody small that they could go up by 50% and I bloody wouldn't notice it, compared to Europe. If I got something in return. But if there's this skepticism that any kind of institutional change involving government or they're just going to be instruments of capital, we can't trust them, then that is going to limit the options that we consider. This may not be the main point, but I think it is an important point, and I think that is one of the reasons for some of the differences between Europe and what we're seeing here. And let me just then comment briefly on Europe, on this business about Eastern and Southern Europe, Greece and Spain, Portugal. I mean, the Europeans got themselves into a complete snip. I mean, like, you have the euro, and once you're tied to the euro, one of the key instruments that you would want to use in Greece and Spain, namely to devalue your currency, is no longer available. And you're also in a situation where you have government debt now issued in a currency you don't issue yourself. You're in a situation of New York back during the New York fiscal crisis in whenever it was, 71 or I've forgotten. 74, okay, whatever. And that's a serious problem. But basically it's misguided policy, and then it is this obsession with government debt and indebtedness that has taken hold. And that becomes a dramatically, serious problem if you then are in the situation of Greece and you don't control your own currency. So it's largely self-inflicted. It has to do with misguided policy, both on exchange rates and on this obsession with debt. Accumulation of capital, yes, it has been weak in some areas, including in the U.S., but it has not been weak on a global scale. There's been phenomenal capital accumulation in China. And why has it been weak in the U.S.? Well, I think Duncan is right. I mean, a large part of it has to do with the fear that the Chinese would eat the lunch, right? And that brings me to one element in that, namely exchange rates, that have been allowed for periods, long periods, to leave the U.S. Grossly uncompetitive. So again, it's not the only element, but there's an element of macroeconomic mismanagement that goes into that story, and there's lots of other stuff. Anyway.